The Center for Storybased Strategy started 10 years ago. We were a group of movement organizers and strategists in communications. We were working in a number of different movements, fighting for racial and economic justice, working to stop wars, working to protect human rights and the environment. But we were all finding that we were hitting the same glass ceilings in our organizing work. Those glass ceilings in the dominant culture that were limiting the scope of our organizing, that were limiting the terms of the debate, and were ultimately obstructing our ability in the movements we were part of to make the kind of fundamental changes that I think all of us here in this room have dedicated our lives to. So we decided that what was needed was to create a movement strategy organization that was focused on building on the timeless wisdom of organizing and movement building and connecting it with strategies to shift the culture. So culture is one of those notoriously fuzzy and broad concepts. As media theorist Marshall McLuhan famously observed, it's a bit like the water we swim in. And so as we started looking at what does cultural change really mean, how can we reclaim that type of role for our movements, thinking about power and potential in the cultural space, we really gravitated towards looking at narrative. Because fortunately, unlike these fish, we humans are the narrative animal. We literally create and construct our social reality together through narrative. That's how we understand who we are, how the world should be, and what our place is within it. So let me just start with a definition of narrative as we're talking about narrative and social change today. Because on one level, narrative is very simple. It's the stories we tell all the time, whether it's around the dinner table or whether it's at an organizing meeting. But if you look at the second part of this definition, narrative is also a fundamental cognitive structuring process. It's the way that we make meaning in the world. And that's what's so essential about it and why it's always been core to the work of organizers and movement builders, right? You know, organizing in many ways is about storytelling. People come together, they share their stories of the problems that they're facing. Together they create a story of how the world could be different, a story of how they're going to get there together. And when that story gets really, really big, that's what we call a social movement, right? So our focus is really on this central piece here, shared narrative, as the essence of the power, where the power of communications and organizing meets. You know, over the last 10 years, we've had the privilege of training over 4,000 organizers, partnering with over 200 different leading organizations, and collaboratively through that decade of work, practice in the field, we've developed what we call the Storybased Strategy methodology. And now storytelling is oftentimes just thought of as down in this tier, just as about communications and media and how do we get our stories out. Now that's very important. It's very important to be able to reach out beyond our base, but that's only one aspect of storytelling. Storytelling is obviously really central to organizing, and a lot of our work at the Center for Storybased Strategy is with alliances and coalitions. And particularly when we look at what does it take to bring different bases of people together, different constituents, different stakeholders to create a shared narrative. That's why the Storybased Strategy methodology it's essentially a participatory framing methodology. How do we build our stories from the bottom up and make sure that our stories include all the pieces that are important to our different constituents? Because that's really, in terms of a movement narrative or a narrative around an issue that can go viral and spread, that's where the power lives. When two folks that maybe are organizing in different communities in different parts of the country, but they have a shared narrative, they're echoing each other's frame. And by doing that, they're aggregating each other's power. And that's what social movements have always done, right? So for folks who are very, like their social change theory in chart form, you can look further in your packet. There is a chart of the whole campaign methodology that we often use with groups. But a lot of, to get into the exciting aspect of it, a lot of what we really do and what Storybased Strategy is anchored in is a narrative power analysis. Now we found that the groups that we support, folks, organizers that are often bringing a very sharp power analysis, a lot of great tools on how to analyze power as it's operating in political and economic systems, right? but very few tools to understand how it's operating in the narrative arena, even though we all know that that's dramatically affecting the context that we're working in. So, particularly in narrative power analysis is about getting at this notion, this difference between truth and meaning. And this is really one of the big jumping off points for this work. A common mistake that we see in the sectors we work in is that folks confuse those two things. We think that just because our story is factually true, that it will be powerful, that it will be meaningful to the audiences we're trying to reach. But in fact, just the opposite is the case. If our story is meaningful to people, if it speaks to their experiences, if it speaks to things that they already believe, they will believe that it is true. Because the currency of narrative is meaning, not truth. So that's, in a nutshell, that's one of the grand strategies of the right in this country that's been so successful, right? How do you make lies meaningful to people? And now let me be very clear, from the Center for Storybased Strategy, we do not believe in lying. We're not encouraging folks to lie, but we're just saying we do have the truth. We have the facts on our side, the facts about injustice, the facts about the potential to make positive change. But if the facts were enough, we'd have already won by now, right? So what does that mean? We have to make our facts meaningful to people, and that means that we have to overcome some of these filters that are already out there. Because the problem isn't necessarily what people don't know. The problem is what they do know. The existing stories that they have that filter out our messages, right? So in a lot of these, as folks have already been mentioning in the spectrogram and other places, are some of the stories that are out there in the dominant culture that have either come from the histories of oppression in this country or being actually manipulated and manufactured. One of the most dangerous stories in the Obama era, the post-racial society, right? Racism is over, African-American president, don't worry about it anymore. And a common strategy is to make these, as I said, these meaningful lies. So whether it's Ronald Reagan's welfare queen or the nasty anchor baby story that's been used against the migrant rights movement, that's, again, it's not about what's true, it's what's meaningful for those audiences. And right-wing strategies to provide a cover for racism and sexism and homophobia. Also in our work, many of these you'll recognize in terms of dominant stories that so many of our movements are facing, but in our work, particularly supporting the low-wage worker sector, we're up against generations of anti-labor and anti-union messaging and stories, to the point where at best unions might be presented to many people as sort of bureaucratic and out of touch, and at worst actually as parasitic thugs. And that's how you get something like the right to work. How could the right to work be used against us, right? How could the boldness of that narrative strategy to actually co-opt our messaging and use it so effectively? So what's really important about a narrative power analysis is helping people understand that in order to reframe and change the story, we need to understand the story. And we need to understand how it works on its own terms. So what that allows us to do is it allows our movements to create a strategy to actually fight the battle of the story around both our issues and the larger context that we're working in. That fight for the broader meaning around an issue. So folks may know Sabrina Smith from Scope in Los Angeles and from California Calls. She had wanted to be here with us today. She was not able to because of scheduling, but I promised her that I would tell the story of our partnership. So I'm going to try to show you a little bit about how some of these ideas work actually in the context of a campaign. We spent from 2009 to 2011 working with California Calls on the story of the California budget crisis and trying to win more progressive tax and fiscal policy. So looking at the initial landscape, folks, any Californians in the room? Californians? So, and folks all followed this story. Obviously, it affected everyone. It's playing out in states all across the place. But folks will remember the height of the budget crisis in California. The idea that California was just broke. Where's the money? I don't know. It's just gone. It's sort of the weather metaphors of the economy. There's no reason. We're just broke. Sorry, we have to cut education and schools and everything. And understandably, the progressive movement was pushed into a bit of a defensive position. So you have here, a fair and balanced budget does not mean cut, cut, cut. Folks organizing, mobilizing, protesting. What jumps out at you from that sign? Cut, cut, cut. Now, it's very understandable why we're trying to explain and show how deadly and horrific these cuts are, but it's not a winning strategy to just say no to our opponent's frame. In fact, we have to be able to challenge and change that story. So we've worked, over the last 10 years with many different sectors, and we've found sort of 5 big strategies that we often use that work for how do you tell a social change narrative? How do you translate the exact same story that might work when you're talking to your coworkers around the water cooler into a political narrative that can move hearts and minds? The first piece, the aspect of framing. Framing's like cropping a photo. We decide what's in the frame, what's not in the frame. People make meaning with what's in the frame. If we're just saying, don't cut, stop the cuts, we're not bringing anything new into the frame, and we're actually just reinforcing our opponent's frame. And people are like, hey, well, yeah, I don't want to cut things, but I hear there's a budget crisis. What are we supposed to do? The characters, it's so important. Stories speak to us through their characters. The messenger is more important than the message, because the messenger is what decides whether we're going to believe the message. We're all bombarded with messages all the time. So that's where our organizing really comes to life, of how folks can bring some of the most impacted folks on the issue forward. The images, we live in a visual culture. We both have to use images and we have to paint pictures in people's minds. Oftentimes progressive communication can err on the side of being, dare I say, a little too preachy, a little too tell and not too much show. But a great way to get those messages out there is to really show folks. And particularly importantly, the foreshadowing, offering people a vision of where we're going. And finally, this last point is probably the most critical one in terms of a narrative power analysis and story-based strategy, and that's understanding the assumptions that are operating in the story. Because a lot of times the underlying assumptions are not present in the story, but an assumption is what you have to believe in order to believe that the story is true. So this idea of making the invisible visible, how do we change the frame by bringing in new pieces of information? In the work that California Calls was doing, for instance, what was missing from the frame was, of course, Proposition 13, California's infamous property tax cap from the 1970s, which had slowly bankrupted the state. So moving forward, how do you make that story? How do you make a story about tax and fiscal policy meaningful? I mean, even for all of us who know how important it is, it's like tax and fiscal policy. What happened to the California dream? This is the pivot from analysis to narrative. Constantly progressives mistake those two. They're very different. What happened to the California dream is a new frame. This is what came out of the year and a half of work with all of the different sectors, education, justice folks, folks working in the criminal justice system, folks working for a more progressive budget, recognizing that we had to get out of the crisis mode and put forward aspirational framing. The characters, how could we, bring forward not only the victims, particularly the children of California, the folks who are embodying the future that we were sacrificing in this false austerity, but also the heroes, the first responders, the teachers, the nurses, the folks who look after our communities, and perhaps most importantly, the villains. How could we bring in the Chevrons, the Bechtels, the corporations that were actually the beneficiaries of the property tax cap and had been influencing things? So another very exciting thing for folks who know California Calls work is that they had done extensive polling to get at a sense of what did they need to take their organizing to scale. They knew who they needed to reach in terms of the values and the demographics and the psychographics of California. But they didn't know how to reach those folks, and it required creating a story-based strategy to start reaching beyond the organized base of the dozens of groups that were involved in the coalition and create what they started calling a California Calls voter. So you'll see when we began the process, it was actually the California Alliance, became California Calls, and we pulled an alliance to renew the dream, that aspirational California dream right up into the core messaging. So very exciting. People probably know the outcome of the story. Proposition 30 just happened last November 2012, so a huge moment, big victory, the first time that what was considered impossible has happened in California. Taxes were raised, 3 new upper income tax brackets. there's other aspects of the story. It's a little more complicated, but the most exciting piece of this is, the incredible organizing work that California Calls did. This is the ballot measure won by 55%. And if you look at the California Calls voter, the pool that they had built, it's about 500,000 people. So that's about 6.1% of the vote. And you can see that's that block. So imagine if California Calls said, we don't need narrative. We're just going to keep organizing the same way we have been, and we're going to work with the base we've got. And they didn't expand their base. You can see that we wouldn't have won that proposition. So I wanted to end just by showing you a picture of one of the most important convenings that we do every year. As Christine was mentioning, we have 3 big strategies for how to change the culture of our movements, to incorporate narrative as a strategic lens into our work. And that's training leaders from sectors that we work with, partnering with those leaders' organizations to actually apply story-based strategy and reframe and shift issues, and convening folks from across sector to cross-pollinate and to examine what's working in their issue field, where places their stories are common, where there's places their stories are different. And you'll see they're all intertwining. So of all of our partners that are here today, if you look carefully, you'll see Lenina is up there in this picture. This is from our last advanced practitioners training that we do once a year. Lenina is going to talk in a little bit about some of the amazing work that Right to the City brought out of this. We've, of course, also got folks from APEN and some of our other climate partners there, like the Indigenous Environmental Network and the Movement Generation. And of course, folks from the Vermont Workers Center and other folks from the low-wage worker sector like NDWA and Endelon and the United Workers Congress. But the important part of pulling all these different groups together and bringing these tools and this approach, bringing story-based strategy, is really what we see is we're creating force multipliers. That narrative is one of the forces that can allow our organizing to go to scale. It can help not only deepen impact, but it can create new alliances, bring different sectors together to create the kind of transformational victories that we need to win. And to put more starkly, if we can't change the story, if we can't push back on some of these embedded right-wing narratives, we can't win on the things that we care about. We can't win in the short term, and more importantly, we can't win in the long term. So we've at the Center for Story-Based Strategy been super excited to see all the momentum that now, as our movements are starting to look at how communications and organizing go together, and some of the new and exciting innovations that are bubbling up. So we look forward to hearing folks' comments, what's working in your areas, and hearing the rest of our stories from the field. Thank you very much.